their own networks. Some people are going through major transitions. This is helping them kind of make that sort of a transition in beneficial ways. And hopefully this is something that can be added to other types of interventions. I think I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was really great to see both of these presentations. And I think that the thing that came out to me when I watched both of them sort of back to back was that they're both aimed at using the network to promote some sort of health behavior. That's the obvious point of an intervention. And I think that one of the things that I was left with at the end is, I've drank this Kool-Aid years ago, and so it struck me as this was the obvious thing we should do. And I think that all of us, we're in this room and we're focusing on the things that work. But I was just curious if either of you had advice or stories or some other sort of sense in what people tend to do wrong. So if you think of like somebody who does a poor network intervention or like doesn't somehow set it up correctly, or the ways that it can go sideways, if that was sort of my first sort of out of the scope, if you will. So if that's an unfair question, I apologize. But if you have thoughts on it, I'd love to hear it.
Well, what I've experienced is not that people do it wrong, is that people just don't do it. I've been in a lot of situations where I'm getting hired and paid to collect network data, report back the opinion leaders to the HR department or other, leadership in an organization. And they go, oh, yeah, but, we're just going to keep doing what we always do. And even though they've paid to have the money, paid the money to have the data collected and have it all teed up for them and ready to go. And you just get a whole lot of resistance out in the field. This is particularly, I've done a lot of work with pharmaceutical marketing companies, and your detail agents want to just go back to the same people they always visit and those who write a lot of scripts, because that's where they see the payoff. And so giving them something different to do is just really, really challenging. The few times that it's happened, it's been incredibly productive and successful, but you just get you just have a lot of resistance to getting a new idea or behavior adopted.
Yeah, I guess I have a similar comment that I just don't see this happening very much, where an intervention that's attempting to trigger behavior change even incorporates the social network. So, it's just something it's kind of ignored as far as I'm concerned.
Huh.
So I don't know that there's a lot of attempts out there that I could say that they should have done it this way or that, because I feel like this is kind of just doing this from the ground up. I don't feel like I have a lot of. There's like a few examples here and there I've seen, but I have so many more questions about how this could possibly be done better. So I hope people try and fail more so that we can all learn from what works and what doesn't work.
Great. Ben, please.
Yeah. So thank you. This was great. Quick question: can either for Tom or David, I don't know about you guys, but I've seen that the cost of doing this kind of work, funding this kind of work, is enormous. And could one of you say something about whether you feel like we're in jeopardy because the possibility of intervention is being affected by the cost of government-funded research? The NCHAP project, since 2000, I think it was originally funded in 2003, is getting close to about $100 million in NIH funding. And that's just it's a 3,000 person, although we've added some panels and couple data and things like that. And it's starting to feel like a big uphill, battle and pushing a train up a mountain kind of thing. And have you guys experienced the same thing? And what do you think this is jeopardizing health intervention studies?
Cost is always an issue. That's for sure. But the cost of not doing this, to me, is much greater, right? We've got, people Well, let's take a hospital, right? There's all kinds of non-evidence-based practices being conducted every day, and it takes a long time to get hospital staff to change their behavior. Now, in terms of cost of doing a network intervention, you can load the staff payroll names into Qualtrics and send out an email and get people to, auto type in the first couple letters of those they go to for advice. It auto fills. My experience in organizations is those surveys get completed in less than 5 minutes. So there's not a ton of staff time that gets wasted. And then you run it through an algorithm, you have the data, you give it back and say, this is the person that's doing it right and everybody goes to for advice. Let's start supporting them so that they can spread the word about it and get it done better. And in my estimation, it'll pay for itself getting appropriate practices being practiced. It took a long time to get hand washing and hand sanitation to be routine behavior in medical care settings. And that really could have been accelerated much more quickly through a network intervention. And there are a lot of other practices that are like that actually are crying out for this kind of work. Now, it does get more expensive if it's going to be funded by NIH, if you're going to need to go through IRB, if you're going to have, complex data monitoring boards and whatnot. But those are a lot of administrative costs that get put forward by the funding agencies and by the universities. But when you go into organizations, things happen fast and not at very high cost. So I think it just depends on the setting really in terms of the cost and what those costs are attributable to and what are the costs to not doing anything. And frankly, it's not like we have other kinds of behavior change programs that can easily substitute for a network intervention. I always maintain that if you don't identify the people who are the opinion leaders in a setting, community, or organization, and they're not on board with what you want to do, you're not going to be successful regardless of what you do, no matter how fancy the glossy, materials and products that you make. It really is the people. And I think when we oftentimes think of interventions, we're always thinking of the product. If you look at all the stuff that the dissemination and implementation groups do, it's all about manuals and products and procedures and standard operating procedure manuals and whatnot. But it's absent the people that are involved. And so you have to understand what the people are doing and who they are and what they believe. That's my take on it at any rate. Which is obviously a rosy kind of view, right?
From my sort of perspective, doing things more in the personal network area, I kind of gravitated towards that. I mean, not partly because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm used to getting like lots of data from a small number of people. At RAND, it was very interdisciplinary, so I would be like the network person on lots of different projects with people who are not network researchers. And it is really hard to sell them on doing like a full network study. Adding sort of an egocentric personal network design to like that kind of fit with a lot of people's expectations. But I guess how much money is being spent on behavior change interventions in lots of different areas that does not address social relationships. And if that is like a major element to how people change their behavior or don't change their behavior, I mean, that's a lot of wasted money there. But so these projects that we worked on, it's really important to have this current project where we have case managers delivering the network intervention, because then we can see in a real life setting, is it feasible? Is it possible? And we're finding that the case managers, when they saw the intervention, they really saw, okay, this is actually, fits a lot with what we're doing already. We're having these conversations with people about their social networks. So this just sort of, standardizes it or formalizes it. And they can do it in their own office with their own equipment. So it's kind of meeting some of those, checking some of those boxes of whether this is like something that could possibly happen in the future. I've had that in mind. Like, I don't want to develop an intervention that it ends up never being possible to be used, just because it requires so much funding or so much resources or drains resources. I've had that kind of practical element in mind along the way. But then it's when you're developing this intervention, it's kind of So we have like small pilot funding. I would like to have more funding to kind of see what it can do on a larger scale. But that's been sort of the goal in mind.
I'm just curious from Ben, if you're free to discuss, is how much of the cost of the increase in cost in something like NSHAP is the tracking cost of keeping track of people over multiple waves versus the actual, showing up in a setting and doing the survey.
I really don't know. I haven't talked to, I mean, I haven't been at on the Midway in, a good 10 years or so. And, but I think my impression is that a lot of the cost is being absorbed by the organization in ORC at the University of Chicago, and hiring people. And I don't know what kind of like insurance things they have to do or whatever, but probably more with hiring interviewers. They have to travel. I mean, when you're doing a nationally representative sample, you have to, people, their plane tickets and things like that, and then you've got, then you've got people who are doing increasingly complex computational stuff. They've got to learn computer programs, and the tracking alone. I mean, so the tracking is an issue as well, of course, but it's just a lift. I mean, and this has been going for close to 20 years now.
But my sense is that, I mean, I think it's an interesting point is that there are a handful of these really big collective good studies in CHAP, Ad Health, obviously, that I'm aware of, and some others like this. And, that kind of, those are the telescopes of social network research, if you will. They're what we're investing in. But I think that the reason you do that is because you have a lot of, smaller cost, but, highly effective, intervention studies and other kinds of small scale studies that then give justification for doing these bigger studies at times. So that could be a way to see. So I guess I agree with Tom, and I think I sounded like David is on the same board, that there's, especially on the intervention side, that there's probably a lot of room to grow on these sides that should be much more cost effective than the large scale national research costs.
Yeah, and the other thing that we have too with the NSHAP study that is creating a lot of, where a lot of the cost comes from is, we're trying to, and this speaks directly to this conference. We're trying to combine the social network measures with high quality health measures. And so when we go to these people and we ask them for, we get their egocentric data, we also get, we do things like we take blood spots,
right,
and biomeasures like height and blood pressure and all that stuff. So they're in there with the interviewer comes in with like a kit and just does all this stuff, and so we do like the way it works is it's like a 2 or 3 hour long thing, and then they so they ask some questions. We start with the network measures, by the way, so that people don't get the fatigue, the respondent and interviewer fatigue that is thought to be such a big problem behind social isolation, inflation. And so we start with that, and then we go in and then we do like little biomeasure breaks. And so then they do, take your height and your weight, and for women there are other kinds of measures, and saliva, and then there's all this lab stuff that they have to do, and they have to ship it off to labs. They have to get all this stuff assayed.
So I think that all of this suggests that that's that sort of puts it in a pinnacle of cost that is a little different than a lot of the other pieces, for sure. Gabe, you had a question, and then I see there's also one in the chat. So
yeah, so my question was regarding the obstacles that you were both describing. Oh, sorry, Tom. You say you might be muted. I saw you talk though. Nope. Okay. The question I had was regarding the obstacles. You both described obstacles that come from the top quite a bit, but your your example of the hospital actually reminded me of this work by Adam Reich on the digitization of sort of doctor data in HR departments in hospitals and in the administration of hospitals. And part of the work of digitization was sort of objectifying the networks of like practice sharing in hospitals and strategy sharing in hospitals. And the blog actually came from the bottom. It came from the doctors themselves, because developing a view, like a bird's eye view of doctors' professional networks in the hospital and try to intervene on it, created a situation where the doctors felt observed, they felt controlled. And so they actually are the ones that rejected the intervention for the most part, or it created a lot of problems that were unintended. And so I guess my general question is, well, there's some obstacles that come from the top, and that's the cost, and that's, you give them the data and they don't intervene on it at all. The other side is, how do you wrestle with the actual individuals realizing that you're giving so much more power to the individuals that are observing them in the first place, to the HR department and things like that. And I can imagine you get a lot of pushback from the people that are being intervened on themselves.
Yeah, one of the things, I haven't seen pushback from individuals so much as just a bit of reticence to get engaged. When we approach the people that are identified as opinion leaders, the experiences that I've been involved in, they've usually been very enthusiastic to participate, because in a way, usually it's not surprising to them that a lot of people are nominating them. They know they're an expert in that area, or they're, a lot of people have come to them in the past. So they're like, oh yeah, no, this would be great. And now you're going to give me some tools to help me do that. So I've seen that side of it be effective, but I have not seen people being, reacting negatively to participating in some kind of intervention. That has not been my experience, other than just a reticence to change their own behavior around how they do things.
Mm-hmm. I think just to jump in on that, it strikes me that one of the distinctions between the kind of things that Tom was just discussing and also the homelessness examples that David was discussing and what Gabe was just mentioning is that the interventions that these health promotion interventions are going to make people's lives better, and they recognize it. Whereas I'm not sure doctors appreciate that, some change to the HR system is going to actually make their daily practice better. So I suspect that you really do have to have, that you have to have aligned interests to get these things to work. Anyway, that's my instinct.
Yeah, even if they have a perspective that we're going to go through all this and nothing's going to change because the way that the administration works, it's based on what political or something like that. That may be reluctance that if they just don't think that it's going to accomplish anything, why bother doing all this stuff?
Right. CG, do you want to ask your question, or would you rather? CG, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm in a shared workspace, so I'm not very good to talk loud.
I can read it for you if you'd rather then. But
yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so CG would like to know, can we speak to the network measure collection and challenges during the process of the implementation, which I take to mean mainly how do you monitor the network change and the effectiveness of the intervention in real time or near real time as the intervention is ongoing? What are best practices or challenges that come with that?
Yeah, well, and we tend not to do that, right? We tend to think of it as pre-intervention, then post, and it always gets staged like that. And then we have tools to incorporate any network changes we see from pre to post, but whether or not we can attribute them to the intervention or not is up in the air. And we don't have any kind of continuously monitoring system to really keep track of how networks are changing and evolving. And to date, there are a lot of electronic resources available to map networks. And I'm thinking particularly in an organization around people who share shifts, work shifts at the same time, or email systems and whatnot. But none of them are particularly fine-grained enough to help us really, in a way, monitor how the network is evolving over time. They're all a bit they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and none of them alone work as well, in my estimation, as plain old survey research, which tends to work really, really well if people are incentivized enough to participate in the survey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the projects I worked on, the challenge that I think is an issue, so egocentric data collection, so we do a baseline network interview, and the challenge is that that has similarities with what the intervention is. So it's fine to have like sort of a baseline network interview and then compare that with a follow-up. But since I think it's a challenge that it's, the intervention sessions are supposed to be short. It's supposed to be about like recent interactions. The only questions we ask are things that are going to be visualized. So we don't, there's a lot of survey questions that we would do in a baseline that we're not doing in the sessions, but they're getting this baseline right away as soon as they agree to be part of the study. When they sort of sense that they're going to have to do this again in the sessions, where we have challenges with getting those who are agree to be participants to actually do the session. That's what I'm experiencing right now with the homeless young adults. And since it's motivational interviewing, it's not supposed to be any sort of like pressuring. It's really up to them to do the sessions or not. It's a sort of an intent to treat approach. So we see that I guess they just have memories of doing this like large baseline survey, and they don't want to do it again. And so our session completion is lower. I mean, a lot of that, it was hard to tell because we were doing this during COVID, and so there's been a lot of like quarantine issues that have happened in the housing building where they live. So there's some challenges with case managers working remotely. But I think that is one of the problems, is that repeating this network interview over and over again is kind of daunting. That's something I'm kind of rethinking of how to do that. So with the study with emerging adults, is we had to move everything online. What we did with the network interview is we showed the people who got the intervention, and then got them to sort of like start thinking about, they saw their visualizations, and so they actually from their responses, they really enjoyed looking at it. They found it interesting. And then they kind of knew that was going to be what the intervention was, where they were going to be discussing these interesting pictures. So I think I would do more of that at the baseline to show the network visualization. So they realize that, okay, now or maybe just even talk about the baseline visualizations rather than starting from scratch again in session one. So yeah, that's a challenge that I've kind of noticed with the measurement.
So one of the things that I was curious about, David, is I think I heard you right in your presentation, is that when you sit down next to the with the adolescent or the homeless person, or the adults that you're working with, is you don't actually put the names on the EgoNet? Is that true?
Oh, no, we do.
Okay.
I took them up for the presentation.
Okay, I was going to say I couldn't imagine how they could remember it if that was the case, and then that does raise the question. We've sort of come through a couple of different pieces over the last couple of days, and I'd be curious for both of you in terms of how, do you ever get pushback on including names? Like when you go and give the presentation at the pharmaceutical company, Tom, do you include the names of the surveys? Do people know it's going to be ahead of time? What's the identification strategy there?
So in the work that I've done, there's been, I would say, a minuscule amount of pushback in terms of physicians receiving paper surveys or electronic surveys in which they have to write down the names of other physicians. Of the I would say there's probably been hundreds of thousands of solicitations.
Right.
There's maybe been 2 or 3 instances where somebody said, oh, you know, wrote on the survey, I don't want to provide names, and mailed it back, you know, that kind of thing. So that's been minuscule. But of course, in terms of reporting the data, it's always anonymized, even when you're working, you know, with the, unless it's a very small select staff that's involved in the research project,
Right.
nobody else will see the names.
Right.
But very specific information about, hey, you should start calling on Dr. X, Y, and Z, that can be provided, but that doesn't show where they are in the network or anything like that.
Gotcha. David, what's your
So for-
reaction? Yeah.
So for, I mean, the personal network, there's a bit of an advantage. We can tell them that, you know, use nicknames, use initials, use descriptions, as long as it's something that you would recognize when asked about it later on. And I'm not sure that they give, like, you know, I've seen interviews where they give a whole bunch of initials and they can kind of keep track of it during the session. I'm not sure if, like, the follow-up interviews, whether they realize, you know, whether they could remember, so I'm relying more and more on, like, the software functions where like we'll match something that's close, text matching, and then say, this is somebody who you said was your blank last time. So that's before I had to, like, match names in spreadsheets in order to see who was the retained and who were dropped network members. But really, you know, during in an individual session, they can usually remember who they named, and they don't have to actually name that person. I've done other studies where we got the first and last name, but we're not getting it. It's not like substance use or anything, like, you know, illegal behavior study. It's like a married couple study. But, you know, one of the issues is, since people, when they see their visualization, they want to, like, have it, they like it, they want to have a picture of it. They
Right.
want to have, like, so when we initially start getting requests for that, you know, it's like an I or B thing. It's like secondary subjects. We've never really came up with a specific protocol for, so, you know, we have, like, the case managers, they can print it out, but then they're supposed to, you know, hang on to it, so we can, like, show it to them later on. For the online one, the group discussions, they had access to an online visualization that they could look at, but it wasn't something that they could download. So for the research study, we've never been able to come up with a plan or a justification for giving people their network with all the names on it. But we don't stop them if they want to take out their camera and take a picture of it. So that's up to them.
I actually thought once that one of the nice incentives you could give back to respondents would be exactly that, especially if you did something like a life history of what their relationship structures look like. It would be a nice way to help them. I do. I think people
I agree.
you know, so.
But, you know, but then you have, you know, these other people who, it's like, if you look at his network, you can figure out just from their first name or their initials who they are, because you can see who they're connected to. And they weren't part of the study. And it's just, you know, once you start going down that route, it's like, you really have to do this and you get by without it. And that's kind of usually where it ends up. But, you know, I agree, this would be, you know, it's something that I would like to incorporate at some point, like, you know, because, you know, they can look at the picture, you know, between sessions and, like, sort of think about it. And it's, like, going to be more present in their mind as they're going about their lives and think about, okay, I set these goals. I'm going to, you know, maybe, like, have boundaries with this one person where I'm not going to do certain things, or I'm going to try to, like, connect more with this person. And, you know, I'm not sure what they're how much they have that map in their head between sessions. And so, yeah, having actual, you know, access to it would probably be more beneficial.
What about incentives? Is there do either you use them often, and what levels of incentives would be effective?
I know my colleagues over in the pharmaceutical business have been, you know, they send out a paper or electronic survey and incentivize with cash the physicians to complete
Right.
them. And it varies by specialty, interestingly enough. But
The amount of money they're offered varies by specialty,
Yeah.
or whether,
Yeah.
Some people's time is more valuable than others. Just ask
Primary
them,
care
right.
physicians just don't get incentivized as high as surgeons, sorry.
It's just interesting that I'm imagining it mirroring, like, we know there's huge disparities in income. Okay, interesting.
Yep, yep.
For a culturally appropriate incentive structures based on the culture of the different subspecialty, I guess.
Mhm.
In the in-chap, we've changed incentives as the project wears on a little bit, each year when we're trying to get response rates, you up the incentive as you get closer to a sort of deadline.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've been in a couple of organizations where there's been no incentive. It's just the boss says we're doing this and people do it.
Right.
So yeah, we give baseline and follow-up incentives for a survey, like a total of like $70 total, 30 and 40. But when we start doing the sessions with the facilitators that Rand hired, where they were going into Skid Row and talking to people, they highly recommended that we give like a small amount, give them some sort of $5 food gift card or something like that, or for each session completed, because they're doing they're using some of their time to give you research information. So that's just a small amount for each session. So now we are doing that both with the controls and the intervention arm, just a small amount. It could be help them for like transportation, or it could just like getting a meal or something like that.
Yeah, in our school-based work, you can incentivize the individual students, but you can incentivize the classrooms and the schools.
Right. Interesting. So Tom, you ended your presentation with some sort of thinking forward sort of bits, and in particular, you were in terms of methods, in particular, you're looking at some of the RDS designs and other sorts of trace designs that sort of get us out of this boundary specification problem. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? Like, what do you think? What's the promise and pitfall of that approach?
I mean, when I've talked to folks, and I've done a couple of these myself, RDS is pretty challenging to implement. You have to keep track of which person's connected to whom when they come back in, and make sure you're not, getting any loops around and that sort of thing. So it's been a lot of work. And there are assumptions built into the RDS model that have to be met in order for it to have its benefit of actually getting a quote unquote hard to reach population and have good estimates of its behavior. And then we did a study where we tested those assumptions and found them quite wanting, right?
Right.
On the other hand, it is a way to reach people, through other people. And I think its biggest benefit is probably going to end up being for NIH and other folks in terms of getting representative groups into clinical trials. That peer-to-peer recruitment, I think, is a really good way to do that. And I think there's going to be some benefit to it. And if NIH gets behind it, then there might be, some more funding for that kind of approach. But it's a challenge. And whenever I do workshops on network interventions, the question always comes up, well, I'm working in a community and I can't interview everybody in the community. What do I do? And I say, I don't know. But what we do know is that even if you just take a sample of respondents from a community, you can still actually get some sense of what the network looks like, even without interviewing everybody. And then we showed both in empirical and simulation work that if your community is not too big, you can have a sample as low as 20% and still identify those who are highest on in-degree centrality, right?
Yeah.
So there are some workarounds, there's some possibilities, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. And there are a couple of projects that NIH funded projects that are working on this. I'm working with folks up in Mayo who actually have to some extent bounded very large Hmong and Hispanic communities and identified their social networks. So it's possible. Yeah.
Huh. That's great.
I would say too, with respect to RDS, I mean, I miss Doug greatly. He doesn't come around much anymore. He retired a couple of years ago, and he used to have an office like 2 doors down from me. And
Mm.
but he on email I hear from him every now and then, but I still feel like we have to do something. Like the snowball sampling should do some kind of tracing and do something to try to collect. It's better than nothing, right?
Right.
Well, I know that Ted Mao down the street and Giovanna Murley, who was on this call earlier today, but it looks like she's had to jump off. They've, and Lindsay is also jumped off, have been working on a version of RDS where essentially you do an ego network survey at every other hop. And so it gives you a chance to get a connected, so you get chains then of ego network surveys. And it's much, if you think an RDS's work, it's much more work because they do a lot of work to make sure that the ego networks overlap in a particular way and that you're just getting it to not loop back in on itself. And so it doesn't save you a lot of researcher time, that's for sure. But it does provide some interesting estimation opportunities to fold network estimations into things. And so what I think I hear in both of you say at this point is that it's a great opportunity perhaps for finding networks, but it might not be the best way for delivering the intervention. Does that sound like a fair summary? I think that what I like about the network interventions is, again, like I said at the beginning, I'm really into, I believe that it's the big missing variable in a lot of these kind of intervention studies, because if you don't have buy-in, all the rest of the interventions are going to fail. I think that's, right. Tom's point to start with is, this is work you have to do whether you like it or not. So you may as well do it in a way that gets you to help as opposed to try to ignore it and hope it's not there. And I think that, I just now, when you pointed this out, it should have been obvious, but the whole point about leaders is that they are visible. So you probably can find them without having to survey everybody in the neighborhood, right? So if you can get just a sufficient number to find them, that could actually be quite useful. So that's, I've already learned something I should have known better, but thanks for pointing it back out again.
Yeah.
Other comments or questions for our panelists or anyone else? Great. We are going to take a quick break for lunch then. I really hope some of you or most of you or all of you could come back this afternoon at 1:30. It's going to be a free-for-all largely. We're going to do what we're calling the Research Design Lab is its formal name. The Stump the Chumps is the informal name of a chance for us to just ask questions. We have 10 brave volunteers who posted some of their projects, and we'll ask them to give a quick overview of those. The videos themselves are 2 minutes long, so if you want to watch them offline, you can do that. But I think it'd be fun for us to learn from each other about the kinds of projects people are doing, and sort of brainstorm some solutions for those specific problems. And so I think it'll be a lot of fun.
I'm not one of the chumps, am I?
Not formally, but you're welcome to be added to the list.
I just want to make sure.
Careful how you ask
out of it there.
Careful how you ask that question.
I think I can easily qualify.
I was going to say, careful how you ask that question. There we go. All right, folks, we'll see you in a half hour, hopefully. And thank you again. And big thanks to Tom and to David for all the help with this. And really look forward to seeing the book, Tom and David. I hope we can twist your arm to come give an actual how-to demonstration of the software next year in person. So
yeah,
awesome. Good seeing you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
bye.